Hello, welcome to lesson and assignment number 24. In this assignment, you're going to be doing some basic information on DNA, genetic traits, heredity, and dominant and recessive traits. Oh, weird. There we go. So, like I said, today this is what you're going to be starting with, the what is DNA package. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 different sheets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of explain the sheet and then let you do the answers for each sheet. But there's 4 sheets, so I'm going to kind of go through them all at once in one video. So the first thing we got to go through is what is DNA. This is a great handout. It really simplifies what DNA is. And you can see here I have a model of DNA. And you can see that there's some black and white things around the outside, but then colored things in the middle, and we're going to talk about what those are. But this is the shape of DNA. Of course, there's 23 pairs of strands like this in every single cell in your body. So this is a little bit bigger than actual DNA, obviously. Now, by a little, I'm being, I'm exaggerating. It's a bajillion times bigger than actual DNA because that's a real number. So if we look down here, DNA is the thread of life. In each of the cells that make up your body, information is stored in the form of DNA. So all of the information about what you're going to look like, how you're going to act, different traits about you, different traits about anything living, all of the things that make you you are stored in this DNA structure inside of your cells, in every living thing. This information is the genetic blueprint that contains all of the directions that control the functions of your body. The differences in the information stored are responsible for all of the inherited differences among people. The cells in your body have stored a great deal of information in a very small space. They can even make an exact copy of the DNA to be passed on to new cells produced in your body. So what exactly is this thing called DNA? It's a complex chemical substance found in the cell's nucleus. That's important to know. DNA is found in the nucleus of a cell. This large organic model is called deoxyribonucleic acid. Scientists studied cells for many years before they discovered the structures within the cells called chromosomes. The chromosomes contain coiled and fixed genes. They consist of 2 strands of connected by base pairs like a twisted zipper. Each individual has a unique genetic makeup. The shape of DNA. DNA is like a miniature ladder with 2 sides and rungs connecting the sides. The sides twist around each other like a spiraled staircase. A word you might look here. Some people refer to DNA as a double helix shape. And that just means like a double staircase kind of with the sides. So once again, there's 2 separate outsides of this ladder, and then there's the rungs connecting them. So outside, outside, and they twist, and then there's these rungs that connect each other. We'll get right into that right away. So DNA is made up of phosphates, deoxyribose. Now these 2 are the outsides. And these 4 bases, these nitrogen bases, adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, are the inside parts. So these 2 are the outside, that's the inside. So you've got, if you look here again, right? You've got your, and it even says deoxyribose, and the black part is phosphate. So this is like a sugar molecule, and this is a phosphate molecule, a sugar molecule, phosphate molecule. Sugar molecule is the white part, so sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate. And then in the middle, you have your nitrogen bases, and you can see there's G and C, which guanine and cytosine, adenine and thymine, cytosine, guanine, and you've got to notice that C only will ever pair with G, and A will only ever pair with T, which is interesting to know as we get a little bit further into this. So you could see the backbone or the sides of the ladder of DNA are made out of phosphates and deoxyribose. So the outsides are all P's and D's. Phosphate, deoxyribose. Phosphate, and you can see there, right? Once again, deoxyribose, phosphate. Deoxyribose, and then the black part is phosphate. I think that this illustration down here is actually very good, kind of explaining how it goes, phosphate, deoxyribose. But then in the middle, when you connect them, it can either be an adenine or cytosine or guanine and thymine. So you can see here, the outsides of the DNA molecule are phosphates and deoxyribose, and the inside right here are adenine and thymine. I can let you read this, but try to visualize the two strands connected by pairs of bases. Each base pair forms a rung in the ladder, or a step in the ladder. The 4 bases will only pair up with each other in an orderly manner. Adenine only pairs with thymine. Cytosine only pairs with guanine. A single DNA molecule or ladder can have thousands of steps. The number of steps and how they are arranged from a genetic code. The genetic code determines the different kinds of inherited traits. So what you got to think of is different combinations of A, G, and C and T in this ladder will determine whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes or curly hair or straight hair, whether you're tall or short. Millions of traits are determined just by what kind of pattern your DNA has here. Is it 3 G and C's in a row, or is it an AT, CG, AT, and then 3 ATs, or things like that? The different combinations that can happen inside of this DNA is what makes you, you. It's what makes every living thing unique, is this pattern or code stored in the DNA, in the nucleus of every one of your cells. So now, your job, first part of the assignment, will be to answer all these questions. And where will you find the answers for those questions? You'll find it off of the What is DNA handout, right? Sorry, right there. So all your answers are the things I just covered. So you'll do that and you'll submit it. Now we're going to move on to the You Are What You Inherit. Now this is just talking about passing on traits from parent to offspring. So let's take a look at this sheet quickly, and I'll do a little read through. This one's a little bit easier. They're going to be talking about whether something is an individual trait. Like, for example, a trait of let's talk about humans. So that's what this whole sheet is going to be. It's going to be talking about group traits versus individual traits. Okay, a trait of all humans would be a group trait. Like, for example, we have 2 legs and we stand upright. That's a group trait that all humans share. But having blonde hair or blue eyes, that's an individual trait within individual humans. So group traits are something that the whole species has, and individual traits are variations within that species, right? So I think they're going to compare birds and mammals in this sheet. So let's take a look at this. So you are what you inherit. The characteristics of living things are called traits. What if you were asked to list 10 characteristics or traits that would describe your appearance? You might include things like dark curly hair, brown eyes, freckles, and a height of 4'6". It would be unlikely that your list would be exactly the same as your classmates. That is because each person is a unique individual. All living things are grouped according to their traits. They may share a group or common traits with other members of the same group, but also have different individual traits. Traits that are passed along from parent to offspring are called inherited traits. The passing on of traits from parents to offspring is called heredity. The study of heredity is called genetics. There's a lot of info there. You might have to go when you do your worksheet and look at that section again. So group traits, this is easy, right? It's easy to distinguish a bird from a mammal. Feathers are a group trait about birds, while hair is a group trait among mammals. That makes sense. All members of a group have certain traits in common. Those are group traits, right? An owl has many group traits that it shares with all birds, yet it has other traits that enable you to distinguish an owl from its other feathered friends. A giraffe is easy to recognize from all other mammals. Giraffes have hair, are warm-blooded, nurse their young, and give birth to live offspring. Like all mammals, you share many of the same group traits with a giraffe, and you share many of the group traits with other humans. Although humans and giraffes share many common traits, they also have different traits that enable you to distinguish them from one another. All humans share certain group traits, but no two people are exactly alike, not even identical twins. There are always individual differences called inherited traits that allow us to identify members of the same group. Individual traits. There are always individual differences called individual traits. No two organisms are exactly alike. Individual traits also help us identify members of the same group. Think of your family and friends. You could tell one another apart, can't you? Can you think of some inherited family traits that your family shares? You are able to tell the difference between your family members, though, and the differences by their differences or the traits they do not share in common. Some individual traits include type and coloring of skin and hair, shape of face, facial feature, size, eye color, etc. So, what you need to do for this sheet is the next part of your assignment. Can you identify 5 traits that belong to all humans? So what would be things that belong to humans? You'd have to kind of think about that. I'm going to just give you a couple of the answers here. Maybe having eye color is a human trait. Being able to roll your tongue, having freckles, dimples, things like that would be traits of humans. Can you tell which one here is Tom and which one is John by reading this description? You'll have to decide. And now you have to decide whether this is a mammal trait or a bird trait. Having hair, mammals or birds. Feathers, mammals or birds, etc. And, of course, the last part here, characteristics of living things are called traits, obviously. Differences of individuals in the same group are called individual traits. And you can fill out the rest there. Then, that brings us to the next section. Right there. I'll roll down that you'll work on. All right. What are dominant and recessive traits? So, for example, say one of your parents has dark eyes and one of your parents has light eyes. Odds are that you would have dark eyes. There's still a chance that you wouldn't, but odds are, and that's because one of those traits coming from one of your parents is going to take over and mask up the other one because it is said to be dominant over the other trait. So, how would you do this? Let's look at this sheet. What traits have you inherited? Every living thing is a collection of traits that have been passed down from down to them by their parents. These traits are controlled by something called genes. Genes are made up of DNA and located in the chromosomes. When pairs of chromosomes separate into sex cells during a process called meiosis, pairs of genes also separate from one another. As a result, each sex cell winds up with one form of a gene or trait from the organism. If the trait for hair is for hairlines, then the gene in one sex cell may control one form of the trait, such as common baldness or an M-shaped hairline. The gene for hairlines in the other sex cell may contain another form of the trait, such as a straight hairline. The different forms of genes for a trait are called alleles. So they're called alleles, and that's a word you're going to have to know. So if you have the genes for blue eyes, or you have the genes for brown eyes, or you have the gene for green eyes, those are different versions of the same trait. Those are called different alleles. So if you're talking about eye color, that's the trait, and all the different versions, we would call those different alleles, or different kind of options. An allele is one pair of genes that can appear as alternatives in heredity. They are located on equivalent portions of chromosomes. Don't worry about that too much. It's a little bit complicated. Most cells in our bodies have 2 alleles for every trait. Two genes for the trait determine inheritance. Gregor Mendel, and we're going to have a slideshow about him in the next lesson. The father of genetics, who studied the inherited traits of pea plants, noticed that genes always came in pairs. Every organism that reproduces sexually or receives 2 genes from each trait, they receive 1 gene from each parent. Mendel noticed, however, that the genes were not always equal. He wondered why some traits found in the parent showed up in the offspring, while other traits in the parents did not show up in their offspring. To find the answer, he experimented with pea plants. These experiments led to a principle of genetics called the law of dominance. The law of dominance states that an organism receives 2 genes for each trait, 1 from each parent. One of the genes may be stronger, we call that dominant, and the trait of the weaker gene or hidden is called a recessive. So this is important. We'll call that dominant and recessive genes. The trait that was always visible in the offspring was considered to be stronger of the two. So if it showed up in the offspring, we called that the dominant. So brown eyes is dominant over blue eyes. Blue eyes would be the recessive trait, and the brown eyes would be the dominant trait. The trait that always was visible in the offspring was considered to be the stronger of the two. It always showed up in the offspring, and it was called dominant. The other trait, the weaker one, usually hidden by the stronger gene, was called the recessive gene. An offspring receives two of the same genes. This is cool. This is a new term. This is where you're going to call something purebred or hybrid. If I get blue eyes from my mom and blue eyes from my dad, and they both show up and I get blue eyes, I'm purebred blue eyes because both of my parents had the same thing. So I'm matching blue from my dad, blue from my mom. I'm purebred. Whereas if I had, say, brown eyes, I got brown eyes from my dad and blue eyes passed on from my mom. I have one that's brown and one that's blue. Obviously the brown takes over, but they're not a matching pair, so we call that hybrid. Or if my mom gave me brown eyes and my dad gave me brown eyes, they're both brown, they're matching. That's purebred brown because they're matching. Don't worry, we're going to have more time to get into this and learn some of the terminology. So if an offspring receives two of the same genes, either two dominant or two recessive, that offspring will inherit or have that trait. There are no other possibilities. An organism with two alleles for a trait that are exactly the same is called homozygous. An organism with two different alleles for a trait is called heterozygous. And don't worry, we're going to be using these words a lot in the next few lessons. If it's confusing now, you're going, what? Keep going along with the sheets, and I'll keep helping you. And once we get into a few more lessons, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. Do the best you can. Don't stress out about it. If you don't understand it right now, don't panic and start asking me a million questions. Give it a few more lessons, and I think this will start to make sense. Pure traits. Pure traits can either be recessive or dominant. Pure traits may have two dominant genes or two recessive genes. For example, a pea plant may have two genes for tallness, which is a dominant trait in pea plants. This plant is homozygous plant with a pure dominant trait for tallness. Don't worry, we're going to get into those terms later. All of the offspring from this plant will be tall. A pea plant with two genes for shortness is also pure. However, in shortness, pea plants is recessive. This plant is a homozygous plant with pure recessive trait for height. So now what you got to know is homo equals the same. Hetero equals different. Homo means the same, hetero means different. So if I had, say tall was dominant in a pea plant, as we're going to look down here later. Say I had one plant, one pea, one parent gave a tall gene here. So it gave a big T because that means tall. If I put a little t, that would mean that it was a short gene being passed on. So say one parent gave a tall gene and the other parent gave a short gene. That offspring would have a combination of big T, little t, one tall, one short. Now, would that plant be tall or short? Well, it would be tall because the big T overrides the little t, so it shows up as this. So the plant would be tall. Its baby between these two parents would be a tall plant. Now, is it big T, or is it big T, little t? It's little, so are they the same or different? They're different, so I would say this is heterozygous. If, for example, if one parent gave a big T and one parent gave a big T, they would show up like this in the baby. It would still be a tall baby, but I would say it was a homozygous tall or purebred tall plant. Another example, if one parent gave a little t and another one gave a little t, so both of its parents were short, kind of like me, and the offspring would be little t, that would be the only way you would have a short offspring. So you'd have a short offspring, and it would be purebred or homozygous short. Don't worry if this is confusing you. These are some new words you're learning. Homozygous, heterozygous, purebred, hybrid. All right, so let's keep going here. The offspring from this plant will be short if it pollinates with another plant. We'll have to go back and read on that. So let's talk about hybrid traits. Organisms that have two unlike genes for a certain type of trait are called hybrid. For example, if you had big T, little t, that would be hybrid. Or we could call that also heterozygous, because hetero means different. There's a big T and there's a little t. They're different. They're heterozygous. A pea plant with one recessive gene for shortness and one dominant gene for tallness is hybrid for that trait. A hybrid is called heterozygous. Don't worry, we're going to be practicing this more. As it has two different alleles, the offspring from a pure tall pea plant cross-pollinated with a pure short pea plant will result in a heterozygous plant, and that's what we're going to talk about right down here, so just wait. So the offspring from a pure tall plant right here, pure tall, crossed with the offspring from a pure short plant will result in a heterozygous plant, one big, one little. We'll see right away. No organism has all dominant or recessive genes. An organism may be pure in certain traits and hybrid in others. Remember, student observers, the dominant trait in one kind of organism may be a recessive trait in a different kind of organism or species. So let's look. This plant can only give big T or big T, doesn't matter when it splits up through meiosis. And this plant, if it mates with this one, right, if the pollen crosses, little t and little t, so it can only give a little t. So every single offspring is going to have one big and one little. So it's going to be hybrid, or we could call it heterozygous plant. And it also, since it's got a big T, it takes over the little t because it's dominant, because that's why we used a big letter. It will always take over if it shows up, right? This one, there's no big T, so obviously there's no tallness that can show up. It has to be a short plant. This one had two big T's, but this one has one big T, but that's enough to still take over and make the offspring tall, which is kind of neat. So now what you need to do is you need to work on this set of sheets here, and you need to go over this sheet as well, which brings us now to our last assignment, where we're going to be doing some Punnett squares. And don't stress out, because we're going to be doing a lot of practice on Punnett squares right away. So let's take a look at this. So you'll have to do that sheet that we just talked about, and then you'll have to work onto this. Don't worry, I'm going to give you a few days to work on this assignment. All right. So some things here, I'm not going to read through all of this because it's a very long assignment, but what you need to know, right, is that capital letters are used for dominant and lowercase letters are used for recessive. So if I'm talking about a tall, big case, big letter means I would be talking about a tall plant. A little letter would mean I'm talking about a short plant. If I had a plant like this, it was tall because that big T takes over. If I have a plant like this, it's tall. If I have a plant like this, it's short. So you'll have to read through this assignment. And now here we go. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about brown, right? So this is where you'd put one parent when we make these squares. Don't worry, this is all new. Don't stress. I'm going to go through and give you some answers for this one. But this would be one parent, and you'd put another parent here. So whenever you're making a Punnett square, you're going to start by making a box, right? You're going to put one parent here, one parent here. I believe here, let's pretend we're talking about brown hair. So B equals brown, and little b equals, actually, let's say big B equals black, and little b equals blonde, okay? So obviously this parent gave a big B and a little b. They are a hybrid parent, but obviously the big B takes over, so this parent has black hair, and this parent also has black hair. So when you cross them, big B, a black-haired child could happen here. If this genetic combination happened, still going to be a black-haired child, except it's going to be heterozygous, big B, little b, black-haired parent, heterozygous, or there's still a little bit of a chance that the little b gene from one parent could pair up with the little b parent from another, and you could actually have a blonde kid. So it is possible to have a parrot with black hair, 2 parrots with black hair, and you still could technically get a blonde kid. It would be a 1 in 4 chance. You'll have to read through the sheet, but I'm going to help you with some of these questions here. So, let's take a look at the work that you have to do on this. Meet George and Gina guinea pig. They are expecting offspring very soon. See if you can use a Punnett square to predict the possible gene combinations of their offspring. George has 2 of the same genes for fur color. He is pure dominant for black fur. So we'll use the letter B. We always use the letter for the trait. So George is going to be big B, big B. That's going to be one of the parents because it says here he is pure for black. So we use big B, big B. Gina, the other guinea pig, has 2 of the same genes for white fur. She is pure for white fur. So Gina is going to be little b, little b. Now what you have to do is you have to make a square crossing Gina and George to see what the odds of their... You're not predicting for sure what their babies are going to be, but you're going to statistically cross them over in a little square to see what chance the offspring has. So let's take a look at this. So we're going to put George on the top here. Oh, sorry, I don't know why I put a G there. I was thinking of George. So George's genes are going to be big B, little b for Gina. So George and Gina, we're crossing them. You always separate the genes with the square, right? So now you drop the B down and the little b, so that's going to be big B, little b, big B, little b, big B, little b, big B, little b. Whoa! Every one of those kids is going to have some kind of in-between black hair version because that big B takes over in every single combination that George and Gina can make. This should be making a little bit more sense right now, but if you're still going, he just made a square and he put some parrots somewhere, I'm not sure, don't worry. You're going to be getting lots of practice, and then we're going to be doing slides in the next lesson explaining the Punnett square process a lot more, so don't worry. How many gene combinations are there? How many different versions could you have here? There's only 1. What is the genotype of their offspring? It is going to be what is the genetic makeup of their offspring. It's going to be 100% hetero black. And what color will the offspring be? Every single one will be black because what? Because, I'll let you fill that out, but it's because there's always a big B in every combination, so it takes over because big B, black hair, is dominant. All right, so now we can go on this one. Mr. and Mrs. Jones. Gary Jones has dark hair. He has 2 of the same genes, so we'll use Mr. Jones with dark hair. He is D. Tina Jones has dark hair too, but she has 2 different gene combinations. She has 1 dominant gene and 1 recessive for blonde. She is a hybrid person, so she has big D, little d. And now you have to cross them to see what kind of combinations they could have. Well, this combination could be big D, big D, big D, big D, big D, little d, big D, little d. So there's a 50% chance they're going to have dark purebred children. There's a 50% chance they're going to have dark hybrid. What are the 2 genotypes that they could have? Pure dark or hybrid. Another word for that would be hetero dark. Go back and read the package. I didn't spend time reading the whole package. Now you can try a couple more of the questions there. I always thought this guy looks like Quentin Tarantino, the film director. But for now, see what you could do out of those packages. See how it goes. And on the next lesson, we're going to actually spend more time looking at these Punnett squares and actually spending a decent amount of time trying to understand how to set them up and what all the different traits mean and things like that. So don't stress too much. Do these sheets as best as you can, and if you're not getting the last couple sheets of this assignment, don't panic, because we're going to be going into it much more detail. Don't send me a million questions. If we do the next couple lessons and you don't get it, fine, no problem. Send me some questions. Take care.